Welcome, everyone. My name is Michaela Klauser. I'm the Director of Producer Education here at NCBA. We have a couple of housekeeping things that I will go over before we dive into our webinar tonight. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen during the webinar, and at the end of the presentation, we will get to as many of those as time will allow. If you are having trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar will be recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at ncba.org underneath the producer tab, or on our YouTube channel. Just Google Cattleman's Webinar Series. The webinar tonight, titled "What Does the Drought Really Cost You?" will feature Ross Bronson. Ross was born and raised in Southeast Idaho, where he enjoyed the outdoors, the area's agriculture, and all things horses. He has a BS degree in animal science, which he coupled with a dual minor of business and Spanish. After graduating, he spent 15 years managing ranches in Idaho, Montana, Colorado, and Hawaii. Ross has a distinct opportunity to attend the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management at Texas A&M Kingsville, where he earned his MS in Ranch Management. As part of the program, Ross consulted for many ranches on issues such as precipitation data collection, marketing strategies for calves, cost of gain versus marginal incremental value of fed cattle, regenerative practices for ranches, and range management and grazing strategies. He was thrilled to be part of this program and considers it to be one of his greatest accomplishments. After graduating, he found an opportunity with Red Summit Advisors as their ag risk consultant to continue helping producers identify the needs of their operations and understand the tools and management practices necessary to address those needs. His favorite things in life are his family, his horses, and being outside. Ross, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Well, I'm so happy to be here tonight and to kind of have this discussion with you about kind of what does drought really cost you. And as I was brainstorming what I wanted to share with you, there's so much conversation going on about drought right now, and I just wanted to maybe look at it from a little different angle, maybe a more information giving in the way of preparedness and how to address it versus, hey, it's dry, doesn't that stink? So that's kind of where I came up with this topic of what does drought really cost you, right? So we're going to kind of go through some case studies and some things like that, but mostly what tonight is about is a prompting of thought. And that's mostly what I do in general on webinars and podcasts and things like that. If you want to get into nitty-gritty numbers, knowing that they're so specific to your operation, we can chat another time. It's really important to me to kind of help drive thinking outside the box, or maybe not even outside the box, but looking at the whole box in the ranching industry. So that's kind of the angle that this is presented from. So where we're heading tonight is we're going to talk a little bit about kind of this idea of drought management versus mitigation and sustainability. Then we're going to move into kind of a progressive case study on drought costs, and that's going to be kind of an important area where we can start thinking a little bit. And then number 3, we're going to look at kind of some mitigation practices that you can do that can help you be better prepared and manage drought conditions better. And then we're going to look at the LFP and NAP programs and give you a little more information on those. And then we're going to move into PRF as part of your kind of sustainability and drought mitigation plan. So first, I want to start the conversation with this idea of management versus mitigation. So management is this idea of dealing with something when it comes. You manage the situation, right? So in this drought scenario, drought comes, and then once drought is here, you start evaluating where you're at, where your forages are at, and making decisions and plans from that point forward. Mitigation is this idea of being prepared for something in a way that will minimize its effects on you. You mitigate the effects on you. And so you'll hear me talking about mitigation. And if it's easier in your head to discuss, to translate that to management, that's fine. Mitigate can be kind of a funny word, but that's why I choose to use the word mitigate, because the whole purpose is to prompt producers to be ahead of the curve and have plans in place long before they need to address drought concerns. And then I don't need to have a long discussion about sustainability. It's such a buzzword, but the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about sustainability is, for me, sustainability is this ability of your operation to continue on profitably into the future. So whatever that looks like for your operation, maybe that's the ability to pass it on to second generations. Maybe for you, that's a focus on the land and how it's producing and how it creates ecosystem. Everyone kind of has their own vision of what that idea of your ranch moving forward into the future looks like. But knowing or deciding how you're going to mitigate drought is definitely going to be a part of this sustainability plan, because if you look at historic overgrazing, while a lot of that is higher stocking rates than the rangeland can probably afford, I think across the West in particular, a lot of that has been from lack of flexibility in how ranchers manage their drought conditions on their ranch, and sometimes out of necessity, right? And sometimes out of lack of understanding or knowledge, right? Because I mean, I've talked to people who thought that the best thing for the pasture was to nub it. And so things are changing, philosophies are changing. The whole point just being, think about how you mitigate your drought conditions will help with your sustainability plan. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what does drought really cost me? What really are the costs of drought? And some of this stuff is going to be fairly evident to you and fairly obvious. We're going to talk towards about the middle part of my presentation as we go through these case studies about things that are harder to put a monetary value on, but that are still really costs to your operation. And my disclaimer here is, obviously these numbers are theoretical. It's the assumption of a 200 head operation, and these numbers aren't to be taken and applied to your operation, but they're to the same principles will apply. So the first part of the scenario is this idea of supplemental feed. So we need to supplement the nutritional needs of our cow herd because of drought conditions. This is because we want them to not eat our forage too much, or you know, we don't have the forage on the ground at all. And so if you have to supplement your cattle's nutritional needs at 30% of their nutritional needs for 60 days, again, 200 head operation, and we're assuming feed costs are about $230 per ton, and I just assumed that you were putting hay out. Obviously, those numbers would change if you're more of a cake operation or some things like that. I did figure in a little bit of labor cost. I figured that in at 15 an hour. For a lot of producers, labor cost will be a little less, but considering that's where a lot of the minimum wage type trends are going, I put it in at $15 an hour, and just assumed, you know, 2 or 3 hours of labor to get the truck and the tractor, load the bale, go out to wherever you needed to be, and feed the cattle. And then, of course, fuel costs associated with that. And my fuel costs are pretty conservative. They only accounted for a couple miles driven round trip. And if you put all those things together, you come to a cost of supplementing your cattle for 60 days of $14,289 for a 60-day, 30% of nutritional value supplementation. That's a pretty aggressive number, and obviously if your herd is smaller, that number is going to be lower, but your revenues really are going to scale appropriately. And so we're still kind of talking about the same bite out of your budget, so to speak. Second, I wanted to go a little further and discuss this idea of, if you don't have that cash laying around, let's assume you've got your operating note, and so you have to go ahead and finance that, because again, hopefully you've planned ahead, which we're going to talk about later, and you have some hay in your barn or whatever. But if this was an unexpected cost because you weren't planning ahead for drought conditions, then there's a good chance that the cash isn't sitting around. So if you assume that you have to put it on an operating note, this extra feed you're buying, and I think I figured about 4.7%, which might even be low anymore. It's going to add an extra $370 in interest if you wait a whole year to pay that amount back. And keep in mind, this is only 30% of supplementation of nutritional value. So if we start feeding at higher rates, 50% plus, these numbers and these interest expenses are going to go significantly higher. And so that's definitely something to consider. And again, we'll get to kind of how these things can drive decisions in a little bit. So the third prong of this progressive case study I wanted to look at is the effects of carrying capacity, because while supplementing at 30% of nutritional value for 1 year is probably doable and stomachable for a lot of producers, the question is, what are the long-term effects that drought are going to have on your operation, and how, as you again look at this idea of sustainability and mitigation, how drought conditions are going to affect you long term. And that obviously is shifting. We've come to understand that as drought conditions get more prevalent, that kind of waiting on drought conditions, which happen every 6 to 10 years, now happen a little more often, and so it's more top of mind. So I wanted to look at kind of this idea of what it would cost in reduction of carrying capacity. So I assumed that your general forage across the landscape is going to drop by about 10% each year for the next 3 years. And I did all my standard, carrying capacity calculations. Basically what I did is worked backward, assuming a certain amount of forage per acre and how many acres it would take to manage 200 head of mama cows, 200 pairs, and then then flipped it back and came forward again and adjusted those acreages and those assumed per acre forage amounts for a 10% reduction in forage. So hopefully that makes sense. So these numbers are based off of forage dropping 10% each year for the next 3 years. So 10% of what it was. So that means over 3 years, you're going to drop by 30%. And that might be a little aggressive, but in really deep drought conditions like we've seen recently, that's not that unheard of. And then in those assumptions, your stocking rates will drop by like 20 animals per year. And that's kind of an average. It's actually kind of a tiered. Naturally, the first year drops more than the second and third because you've already come down a little bit. But look at these numbers. I mean, if we assume an 82% weaning rate at an average 500-pound calf at $1.90 per pound on the price on that, in your first year with 200 pairs, the first year that you drop, I believe comes to about 180 pairs. And let me pull that up so I can say for certain. Yeah, it drops to 180 mama cows. So that drops your revenues by 15,500 with these assumptions, an 82% weaning rate, et cetera. So that's not happy, but we can probably manage around that. But keep in mind, you also just got done feeding, almost this same amount of money in supplemental forage. And so we're really looking at almost $30,000 in costs that maybe you hadn't really planned for or were ready for. So then in the second year, it drops another 10% and your carrying capacity drops down to 162. mama cows. Now your revenue has gone down by an additional $14,000 over year one. So now we're really starting to feel the effects of it. And this isn't because we necessarily, I mean, obviously we're selling cows, which is gonna make up some revenue, but this is just carrying capacity on your landscape. And in the third year, the carrying capacity drops to about 146 head, which drops it again an additional $12,600 in potential revenue that you don't have now because of drought conditions. So again, it's important to think about the long-term effects that drought can have, not only on you and your stress levels, but your operation and your landscape and the fiscal concerns that you're going to have associated with this. And now, I mean, I didn't even look at if you put this total $42,000 of that had to come from somewhere else, right? Because you're down that much revenue. So what expenses are you cutting, or are you going to your operating loan, right? Now we start putting $42,000 on an operating loan, and our interest costs are going to be quite a bit higher. So, and the other thing I really wanted to talk about is those are pretty easy to calculate, but there's a lot of unforeseen costs that really are a cost and that are harder to calculate. And I wanted to be sure and address some of those in this discussion, because that's where I think the thinking is really important, the forethought and the understanding of how drought is going to affect your operation and making prior planning to be able to avoid these kinds of things. So the first one you'll see there is this idea of restocking at a later date. And many of you understand this and the struggle with this, right? So not only are you going to liquidate cows when oftentimes they're in a depressed market. We haven't seen that as much more recently as the market cow price has really been rather robust. But you're still going to sell those cows, and then you're going to go back in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and either you're retaining more heifers, which of course is going to have a financial impact that maybe you hadn't planned for, or you're going to be buying pairs or replacements of any kind. And the cool part about that is it might be an opportunity to do some genetic changes you've been waiting on, but most likely those replacements are going to come at a significantly higher cost than not only your cull cows, which we're probably still producing for several more years, but also than replacements would have cost prior to drought conditions or during drought conditions. So this cost of restocking at a later date is definitely a concern, and I have discussed in kind of some other presentations some ways that you can kind of help manage that, and one of those is just don't buy replacements, and that if your operation can handle that. But most operations will want and need that cash flow back. But the next one there you can see is the cost of selling cattle on the depreciation schedule. And depreciation is such a tricky little thing because it's this kind of ghost cost. A lot of people say it's not a real cost, but from a balance sheet profit financial statement, right? It still is on there. From a financial standpoint, taxation, etc., your depreciation is on there. And so many of you, when liquidating cattle, are really probably liquidating cattle in the first round of culling that are off the depreciation schedule. But I would guess that a lot of you, as you start doing maybe a second and a third cull, as you are looking at grass and forage come, whatever it is in your area, July, August, when things get really bad and you're really needing to get off your range, then you're probably selling animals that are on the depreciation schedule. So you're going to continue carrying those animals for several more years. My guess would be 2 to 3, and hopefully not more than that. Otherwise, you're probably culling younger cows, or they're going to be cows that you just purchased. So that's a tricky cost that a lot of people don't think about, this idea of selling cattle that are on the depreciation schedule. Lost genetic improvement. This is really tough. If I had a gentleman I knew, this was probably back, well, it was back 14, 15 when prices were really high. You know, he had gone and bought a bunch of replacements, and that was a mistake of its own, but he was trying to improve his genetics, and then later had to get rid of those cows because of in his scenario, it's almost backward of what we're talking about here, where he bought replacements at the height of the market, and then as the market came down, he couldn't pay the note for them, but he lost that genetic improvement. So if you're in a similar situation where you have bought some really good replacements or some high quality bulls or something like that, that then now these drought conditions are kind of forcing your hand at getting rid of those, you're going to lose some of that genetic improvement. And kind of along those same lines, if you have been working hard on your genetics over years and years and years, say you've got a closed herd and you're happy with what your cows are doing, happy with how your calves are performing, and now you have to do an aggressive cull, well, that's going to be tough to replace. Those types of operations have built those genetics over oftentimes generations, for sure over, you know, probably several decades of having kind of those closed herds of exactly what they're looking for. And so now you're needing to restock, and who knows if you can find kind of what you really want. So that can be, the restocking later from a genetic standpoint is kind of a double-edged sword. It can kind of go two ways. And then here I also have reproduction concerns. You know, what's your rebreed going to be? What are the body condition scores on your cows? Not only that, but even if your cows have a decent breed up rate, what's the birthing rate going to come to after they've, you know, especially if you're on winter pasture that's affected by drought, or whatever your counter calving pasture is, right? So if you're a fall calver, we might be talking about your summer pasture. But still, these reproduction concerns can have similar financial repercussions as the lowered stocking rate, because as your breed up goes down and your calf crop goes down, and maybe you're struggling to get calves to wean to weaning age because of the drought. So you're going to have similar drops in revenue from the smaller calf crop. And one thing I didn't get on here that I was thinking about today is this idea of labor costs. And I'm not talking a true cost per se, but I'm talking more along the lines of if your carrying capacity drops by 20, 30, 40 head, you know, now what do you do with your cowboy or your manager or, you know, your working man, any of the labor that you have in place that maybe you're going to struggle to pay now, because, you know, when we're talking $42,000 over 3 years of lost revenue, the question then becomes, how do you handle that? Do you bite the bullet and lay them off? Do you continue to pay them, waiting for better times? It's a very hard thing to handle. And as many of you know, labor in the ranching industry is getting harder to find and a little more sparse. And so keeping quality employees is an important part of this conversation, I would say. So that's kind of my thinking part of this presentation, right? So I hope that through some of those examples, I was able to sort of help you see how you need to think beyond just what you see in what drought is really costing you. And so I want to talk about this idea of mitigating drought through prior planning and preparation, right? Again, to the point of the term mitigation. So there are management practices that you can put into place there are a lot of different things that we can discuss here. And I'm going to kind of discuss 4 points of this that will help you to mitigate drought, meaning create a drought plan that you have in place so that as you monitor your rangeland conditions or your precipitation, you can go to this drought plan and have something in place. It helps avoid reactive and emotional decisions. It's well thought out far in advance so that you and anyone who's involved in the operation of the ranch has had a say in that plan, and it just will help you go into these drought situations a lot better. So the first I wanted to talk about was this idea of an accurate and conservative stocking rate. And this is kind of where, again, you might see a little bit of my, some of my regenerative experience come out here a little bit, and that's fine. Take it with a grain of salt if you want, but you still need to stock your rangelands appropriately. So make sure that you are accounting for your actual cow size, not a 1,000-pound cow, okay? Because I go to the auction barn every week if I can, but usually hit it about twice a month, and there's not very many 1,000-pound, mature 1,000-pound cows that go through that auction barn. So make sure you account for, a 1,200, 1,300-pound cow when you're setting your stocking rates. One of the biggest challenges here is addressing what your forage is really doing. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but make sure that you are accurately calculating how long you really stay on. Be conservative, right? Make sure you're only accounting for you're accounting for what your cows will consume, but also what I call other disappearance, which is this idea of erosion or wildlife consumption, things like that where forage isn't available. Another important thing is to consider how much of your landscape is actually usable by the animal, right? So I was actually just looking at a little acre not too far, or a little parcel not too far from me, and it's I think 100 and something acres, but it's 90% hillside, right? And I'm talking like mountainside. So obviously I'm not going to graze very much of that acreage. So that's enough of my soapbox there. Just make sure that you are really putting thought and effort and being accurate in how you're calculating your number of animals on your acreage, and then more importantly, be flexible so that as conditions change, you can stay ahead of things. Build in a buffer. Kind of along those same lines, there's a lot of tools out there as the GIS system, the mapping and satellite system has gotten better and better over the years. We've gotten so many new tools that are just so awesome in how we can manage our landscapes and be prepared for these drought scenarios, knowing how much forage we have, things like that. So this is just 2 examples that that I'm showing you. There are many things out there that can help you really look at your forage. I really like the rangeland analysis platform. I used that for my master's project, and so I'm very comfortable and familiar with it. The rangeland analysis platform allows you to see historic trends in forage growth, historic trends in precipitation. It also allows you to see trends in forage growth over like 16-day periods. And then so you can go in and create a plan and then go back in on the current year and see what's actually happening. Now, we all know these aren't perfect, so it's important that you also are out there on the land looking at things. But if you combine those 2, along with other tools you might have for rangeland management, then you'll get a lot more accurate calculation of how many animals you can actually put out there. And then the Colorado State Stocking Rate Calculator actually just happened on this a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and was playing with it. This basically, it uses the similar data as the rangeland analysis platform, but it has a lot of the calculations kind of working in the background so that you don't have to do quite so many pencil pushing yourself. Next, pre-planning. So this is probably the most important part of this conversation. Everything else is kind of part of this. So pre-planning, and I mentioned here a tiered culling process, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. A tiered culling process is this idea of identifying which classes of livestock are going to be sold or culled at which stage in your plan. So when you recognize you're coming into drought conditions, we're going to sell broke mouth cows first, smooth mouth or broke mouth that are older cows that are, probably only good for a couple more years. And then, and again, this is just examples. You can make these decisions for your own operation. And then our second tier might be maybe older running age cows. And then third tier might be early weaning of calves, or, second tier might be open cows that are younger. Anyway, just the whole point of this is to create a process. Again, I talk about your drought mitigation plan, right? Create a process by which you have a plan in place, so that, especially on ranches with really large landscapes, it can be really challenging to access these cattle. And so part of this tiered culling process is this idea of knowing when cows are going through pens, and those decisions can be made. Other pre-planning decisions, where are you going to go with your cows if you have to get off your rangeland, whether that's dictated by those who manage your leases, or whether that is a decision you make yourself. Where are you going to go with these animals? Are you going to go into the corrals? Do you have feed stocked in the stack to feed? Do you have access to additional pasture lease? Have you made arrangements with local farmers that allow you to graze some of their crop residual, or maybe planting cover crops, things like that? Do you have electric fence on hand to fence those fields? So I mean, I could go on, and again, this is operation dependent, but put these plans into place so that you're prepared, and the decisions essentially have been made beforehand, and you're not wringing your hands trying to figure out what you should do. And then lastly, and I'll kind of build off this idea of risk management, and I'm going to talk about PRF, but I want to be clear that risk management encompasses a lot of things. Insurance and government programs are a part of that, but risk management to me is a mindset, and it's this idea of identifying your risks, knowing what they are, and knowing how best to manage them. So again, back to the example of, if your animals have to come off pasture, where are you going to go with them? That's part of risk management. You are managing the risk that your livestock will have to come off pastures. So the first thing I want to talk about here, I'm going to talk about LFP a little bit, and I'm going to talk about NAP. And these are basically the USDA's two drought applicable programs for assistance. Excuse me. So first, LFP. So LFP, you can see here, this is kind of a lot. I'll try and break it down. LFP covers loss due to drought on any rangeland, or it also covers if there was a wildfire on federal rangeland and your rangeland managers told you can't graze it if there's a fire. So it covers both of those. LFP is a very tiered program. You can see here, depending on the level of drought you're in, depends on how much assistance you can get from it. And so, I'm not necessarily going to dive into the two different aspects of the different drought, but I did come and look at kind of that same scenario, a 200 head operation with, 82% weaning rate, and I just assumed that's what you had on the ground at the time. If your area was in D2, D3, or D4 drought, this is the assistance you could get from LFP. And again, you can see up here, it kind of depends on how much drought existed in your area. When it says 3 times monthly payment, they have a chart that they use that has dictated monthly payments that is updated at each crop year for a breeding cow, a non-breeding cow, a bull, calves, and they even have horses and such on there. My biggest trick with LFP, I think LFP is a good program. It seems to work fine. I have taken advantage of LFP in the past when I ran cattle in Colorado. The problem I have with it is these payments come in after the need arises, because these have to be declared drought situations, and you just don't know how long the drought is going to exist. It's all working off data collected, right? Not forward-thinking data. And then NAP, I kind of laughed at NAP a little bit. I had one person tell me that NAP is never are paid. And after diving into NAP a little bit, it really is kind of designed that way. It's considered catastrophic coverage. Your loss has to exceed 50% of expected production, and then you get paid at 55% of the average market price for the crop. And NAP, it covers a lot of crops, so that aren't covered by crop insurance. It can cover pasture land, but you can't buy additional coverage for pasture land. Other crops you can. It does have service fees associated with it, but this is the thing. I took my same scenario and I said, okay, so if I assumed I have a 120-day grazing season, and I got cut short by 60 days, I wouldn't get a payment from NAP because it was I didn't have enough loss. So NAP is a very catastrophic coverage. By all means apply for it if you feel like you're down enough. But with those service fees, I would make sure that you meet those parameters. And here's just kind of an illustration. I'm going to dive into PRF in their last 5 or 6, 7 minutes here. This is just an illustration of how PRF and NAP in particular would interact. So assuming you got 90% coverage of your rainfall, your average precipitation, and that the blue here represents your actual precipitation, you can see that there would be, we'll call that 10% below your coverage level, and you would be getting an indemnity, a payment here long before you even consider NAP. And you can do PRF and these federal programs. So I'm not saying don't do LFP or don't do NAP. We've had a lot of people, as we've discussed PRF, say, well, I do these other programs through the FSA. Well, that's fine, and you can do both. So kind of again an overview of PRF insurance, and I'm happy to have this conversation now. It's sometimes in the fall it gets kind of frenzied about PRF with the season being so short. So we talk about PRF insurance as being coverage for moisture volatility, because that's really what you're doing. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because a lot of you have heard these pitches already, but I want to make sure you understand it, and feel free to ask some questions about PRF if you want to. But this is kind of how it works, right? You have your coverage level based off your 70-year average, and then what actually happened, and this is where you get paid. The coverage is placed in 2-month intervals, and so this graphic shows the black line is your actual rainfall across a year, and it shows kind of the 2-month intervals. You can do January, February, and you can insure February, March, but you can't insure both. So you can't double insure any one month. But you can see there's your 90% coverage, and you can see where your rainfall dropped below that. And that's where PRF, if your coverage is placed there, would start paying out. So kind of to further illustrate that, and again, I'm talking about sustainability, okay? So I'm talking about how PRF and LFP and NAP and these other management decisions will feed into your management plan and your sustainability. So that's why I'm bringing this up, okay? A lot of, I guess, I don't know that a lot, but there are plenty of insurance providers who kind of do a blanket coverage. And so you can see here, if you do a blanket PRF coverage in each interval, you're covering areas where you were high, and you're covering areas where you're low, and that's fine too, but you're missing an opportunity to place more aggressive coverage in areas that have lower rainfall. And these are, I'll talk in just a minute, these can be identified through software of where is most potent to do this. So that's evenly spread. We talk about intentional coverage, again, as part of your sustainability plan. Make sure you're thinking through this using software to allocate it appropriately. But you can see here how the coverage has changed to place better coverage in areas where there was lower amounts of rainfall. Again, this is just an example of the software. This is the software we use. It is not proprietary to Red Summit. There are other agencies that have it. My pitch is always just make sure whoever you're talking to has good software, because that's what's most important to allocate coverage. This is we can put in all your counties and all your grids, and we can analyze them, and it'll run, you can see here, oh, I don't have it on this one. It'll run tens of thousands of iterations of coverage and help identify where it's best to place your coverage. And you can see here, this is what analyzes it. It shows which grids have the best net indemnity and how often you would have paid out in each one. And then we can present it kind of in this fashion so that you can really see what you're going to do. So again, in the name of risk management and risk tolerance, some of you may look at this chart and say, wow, that is awesome. And some of you may look at this chart and say, that's not worth the risk. And that's your choice, but at least you've made an informed decision. So that's kind of my thing there. Make sure you talk to someone about these different programs. Make sure you know your FSA agent and have a relationship there, so that if you want to use NAP or LFP, you can. Get some information. Please remember that PRF is a locally based program. It's based off your local rainfall. So even if your average is 22 inches annually, it's the deviation from normal that you're really looking at. So last here on my plug for PRF, we are a PRF company, but my most important thing here is this program is getting so popular and is talked about so much because it really is a game changer in the rancher's ability to be sustainable and to weather these climate conditions that are changing the way that drought has become more prevalent. It just really is a game changer, and the numbers are always specific to your operation. You don't have to talk to me, and you don't have to talk to Red Summit if you don't want to, but I encourage everyone to talk to someone, and again, someone who has software, to just discuss how this can help with your drought mitigation plan. So kind of lastly, since I got 1 minute left, so we thought that, grilling season's coming up. I can finally see my grass up here, so I'm getting pretty excited about warm weather, which is premature because I won't have warm weather for several more months, but guys got to have a dream. So if you want to text SPICE to this number, 68902, we'll send you our signature SPICE blend. And then you can also get this cool map. This is one of the things we use for our company as we allocate software. We have this coverage. We have this really cool mapping software, and we can give you a map of your area for free. So it's fun. A lot of people really like that. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Michaela.
Great. Thank you so much, Ross. We really appreciate you taking the time and presenting such great information for everyone tonight. We have quite a few questions coming into the question box, and so we can go ahead and just dive into some Q&A here.
Great.
So you mentioned the rangeland analysis platform, and some folks were wondering if there are any imperfections with this platform and if you could provide some examples.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm certainly there are. I would say some of the trickiest ones are, the more real-time data, the 16-day biomass. It's all satellite based. So there's some nuances there. They have those who kind of designed it and have stood behind it have run it through a lot of scenarios, and so I feel like it's it just gets better and better and better, and they are creating strategic partnerships with a lot of different places and people and organizations to use it. But certainly there are flaws, and I would say the flaws are in the finer details. So, and that's why it's so important to make sure that you're not relying solely on it, especially if you have large landscapes where it might be a little off. But in addition, if you're, say a more eastern operation with higher stocking rates per acre, there's a good chance that it might be not quite as accurate there, I would guess.
Thank you. That's some really great insight. And, on the similar theme, so let's say someone is just starting out, taking this into consideration, and they're very unfamiliar with software and online platforms like the analysis platform and the Colorado stocking rate calculator. What other resources would you recommend for producers, or who would you recommend producers reach out to?
Yeah, so my first place is always going to be, extension agencies. That's what they're there for. Most extension programs are going to have a rangeland guy who's probably familiar with these softwares and can help you use it. So that'd be my first step, is to talk to your extension program. Other than that, I mean, the reason I exist really as part of Red Summit is for just such a scenario. And there are others like me, so you can find a consultant of some sort. My services are just a value add that Red Summit has chosen to provide. So there is no cost for my services. And so you can talk to someone like me in your area, or me personally, who has exposure to and a little more practice. And then if it's just about the software, there's a good chance anyone under 18 could help you figure that one out.
Great. Another question coming in. So it seems in a drought, some folks focus on preserving the cows and primarily their genetics, and some folks focus more on preserving grazing land resiliency to bounce back more quickly after drought. Do you have any recommendations to help ranchers check their own logic and priorities when making these tough decisions?
Yes. So first of all, there's always a middle ground. There is a conservative stocking rate that isn't too conservative. And so my first statement is find the middle ground, unless you have, there are people who put a lot of emphasis on ecology and habitat management, and they're making those decisions on purpose. But in general, I would say that the discussion is really about what am I trying to say here? So as an example, if you're heavy into genetics, that's fine, but your rangeland still needs to support your cattle long term. So I always kind of default to being more in protecting my rangeland, because that's my, it's this age-old adage of ranchers are grass farmers, right? And I never loved that saying, but it's really true if you think about it. So if you're not caring for your grass, which can say, is some would say is the most important thing, you're definitely gonna feel that down the road. So while you don't have to go hardcore that way, I would definitely say always err on the side of your grass, because it's what's carrying you through.
Great. And we have time for one more question. So we had a couple questions regarding any nutrition concerns, specifically for the rapid amount of moisture received in areas that have experienced extreme drought for an extended period of time. So do you have any thoughts or feedback on that?
So I do. Let me just start this by saying nutrition is not my strong suit, although I think I got a B in my nutrition class. So my statement there, especially after drought, and you've got this nice fresh green grass coming up, and you're going, "Whew, thank heavens," right? It's really tempting to go on this strong young grass with these cows that have been eating dry standing forage or harvested forage. And so my statement would be just take a step back and let that grass get just a little older before you kick out on it, and you'll be able to manage most of those situations. And then from a specific standpoint, if you're really worried about it, fill those cows up with some hay and turn them out full. And after that point, a lot of those cows will really kind of manage themselves if they're not hungry going out on it. They should be able to adjust. But in general, just be careful not to go out on too young of forage. And sometimes it's a week or two is all you got to wait, which I get if you're feeding a bunch of cows is hard.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned extension before, and, that's always a great resource. Reaching out to your local extension forage specialist as well could be a good resource for that.
Yes.
With that, I think that is all we have for tonight. Thank you again, Ross, for presenting for us and sharing that great information on mitigating risk when it comes to drought. I also want to let everyone know that we have another webinar this month on March 30th. So please check that out and register. Registration is available online at ncba.org underneath the producer tab. And thank you again, Ross. And I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you so much.